The cruise ship Elysian drifted effortlessly over the dark waves, cutting through a sea that shimmered under a pale, watchful moon. Yet, for all the luxurious offerings aboard this floating paradise, opulent dining halls, dazzling entertainment, and the glittering allure of endless pleasures, something shadowy and rotten festered below the surface. A ghostly current of dread whispered among the passengers, though none dared to acknowledge it. Most assumed that sinking feeling in their stomachs was the result of too much fine dining or too much champagne. Only a few souls felt it, the oppressive, unnatural wrongness that clung to the vessel like seaweed. Eleanor Collins certainly felt it. The first night had been delightful, a blur of sequined gowns, cocktails, and jazz music swirling through the ship's ballrooms. But tonight, as she wandered through the quiet corridors near midnight, she felt the whisper of unease tickling her spine. Her fiancé, David, had gone ahead to explore the ship's ghost tour, a laughable gimmick aimed to thrill, but Eleanor had grown bored. A glass of wine would calm her nerves, she reasoned, and she was on her way to the lounge when a soft sound made her pause. A sigh, deep, mournful, almost human, echoed through the hallway. Eleanor stopped, her heels silent against the plush crimson carpet. She turned slowly, the sound clinging to the air like mist. The hallway stretched before her, lit in patches by antique sconces casting pools of dim light. She swallowed. Nothing moved. But as she stood there, she realized the corridor's stillness was unnerving, almost too empty. It was as though she had slipped into a painting, frozen in a moment just before something went horribly wrong. "David?" she called softly, though she knew he wouldn't be there. The sigh came again, now echoing from somewhere close. Eleanor shivered, unsure whether it was the cold breath of the ocean breeze sneaking through unseen cracks or something else. She pressed forward, telling herself not to be foolish. Ghost tours and stories of hauntings were nonsense, superstitions for thrill seekers and the easily spooked, yet the silence around her thickened, taking on a weight that pressed against her chest. As she rounded a corner, Eleanor nearly collided with an elderly steward dressed in a faded navy uniform. He stood perfectly still, eyes wide and unblinking, skin as pale as porcelain. His presence was so abrupt that Eleanor gasped. "Oh, I didn't see you there," she managed, trying to laugh off the awkwardness. The steward didn't respond. His eyes, a dull gray, locked onto hers. There was something so unnerving about the emptiness behind his gaze that Eleanor's smile faltered. He seemed to study her, his expression stretched into an odd, unsettling neutrality. "Can I help you?" she asked, taking a step back. "Watch for the water," he whispered, his voice gravely and low. "It comes from below." Before Eleanor could question him, he turned sharply and vanished around the corner. The rustle of his uniform faded as if the ship had swallowed him whole. Unease prickled Eleanor's skin, and she quickened her pace toward the lounge. Perhaps some laughter and music would drive away this bizarre encounter. But when she entered the lounge, she found only darkness and overturned furniture. The grand piano, once the centerpiece of the space, lay on its side. Keys cracked and twisted like broken teeth. Chairs were scattered haphazardly, and shards of shattered glasses glittered across the polished floor. Eleanor hesitated on the threshold, her heart thudding. Where were the passengers who had been here earlier? The bartenders who had served her drinks with a smile? The lounge looked as though a storm had torn through. A low gurgling noise emerged from the shadows, wet and throaty. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the center of the floor, where a dark, glistening puddle had formed. It spread slowly, oozing out from the space between the floorboards, thick and ink-black like oil. She watched, transfixed, as it began to pulse and ripple, as though alive. "Help!" The faint whisper came from somewhere in the darkness. Eleanor turned, peering into the room's shadows, where the puddle now seemed to stretch with hungry tendrils. A shuddering, dragging sound accompanied the gurgling, and she realized with horror that something was trying to pull itself from the liquid. Limbs emerged first, slick and glistening, clawing at the floor as if drowning. A face followed, eyes bulging, mouth locked in a scream, as if this thing were caught in a perpetual state of terror. Eleanor stumbled backward, the reality of the situation cracking through her composure. She spun and ran, the sound of wet, slapping footsteps echoing behind her as she fled into the ship's labyrinthine corridors. She burst into a ballroom, the grand chandelier above casting fractured light across the dance floor. Here, dozens of guests stood still, their backs turned to her, faces hidden. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps. Relief flooded through her, mixed with the confusion of seeing everyone in this frozen tableau. "Please," she called out. "Something's wrong. There's—" But her voice trailed off as she moved closer. The guests didn't stir. They were dressed in extravagant attire, but their clothing was tattered and soaked through with water. Rivers of seawater dripped from their sleeves and hair, pooling around their feet. A woman near Eleanor turned slightly, her neck creaking like the groan of a ship's hull. Her eyes were wide and vacant, mouth open in a silent cry. Her skin had a blue-gray pallor, and seaweed clung to her sodden curls. Eleanor took a step back, colliding with someone behind her. She whirled around to find David, his face pale, eyes glassy, but his grip on her arm was vice-like, cold as ice. "Eleanor," he rasped, though his voice sounded warped, choked with water. "You have to see." With unnatural strength, he pulled her toward the ballroom's massive windows. Outside, the ocean swirled inky black, but as Eleanor's gaze fell upon it, she saw them. Hundreds of hands, ghostly pale, pressing against the glass from beneath the water's surface. Faces emerged, mouths open in eternal screams, trapped between life and death. The ship shuddered beneath her feet, the windows creaking as if about to burst. Eleanor screamed, trying to pull away, but David's grip tightened. His lips moved near her ear. "They were never meant to leave," he whispered. "Now the sea wants us all." With a final groan, the windows shattered. A torrent of black water engulfed them, filling Eleanor's lungs, pulling her into a freezing, suffocating embrace. Her last sensation was the icy drag of the ocean, a chorus of drowned voices welcoming her into their cold, dark eternity. Elysian continued to glide silently across the waves, like the laughter and music from above deck masking the horrors unfolding below. But deep in the ship's belly, where the water seeped and whispered, the sea claimed its own. The old cargo ship Mariner's Bane drifted aimlessly across a sea that never seemed to rest. Thick, impenetrable fog enveloped the vessel, shrouding the world in ghostly white, and the haunting creak of its hull punctuated the suffocating silence. The Bane was no cruise ship but a rusting relic that had been sold off to host private mystery charters for the brave and curious. Tonight, the ship's grim reputation of being cursed felt dangerously close to reality for its small group of passengers. Zara Jones had signed up with her friends for this once-in-a-lifetime ghost voyage, thinking it would be nothing more than a cheap thrill. They had been promised spine-chilling tales told by hired actors, spooky fog machines, and a night filled with exaggerated legends about sailors who had never returned from the Mariner's Bane. But when she and her friends found themselves separated from the others, the fear felt far too real. "Guys, where did everyone go?" Zara whispered, her voice shaky. She clutched the flashlight in her hand, the beam of light trembling as she swung it across the dim hallway. Ryan, her boyfriend, was ahead, his expression shifting between frustration and concern. "They probably doubled back to the main deck. It's just a trick to scare us. Let's head back." "Shh, Amy," Zara's best friend hissed. She froze, her eyes darting around. "Did you hear that?" All three of them fell silent, straining to hear beyond the muffled groans of the ship's ancient timbers. The sound came again, a faint, whispery giggle, echoing from somewhere deep in the foggy maze. It sounded disturbingly childish, almost playful. A cold wave of fear coursed through Zara. "It's probably one of the actors," Ryan muttered, though his voice wavered. "Just some kid trying to creep us out." Zara didn't reply. There was something unnatural about that laugh, something that made her heart race. She tried to shake the feeling and took a cautious step forward when suddenly an ice-cold draft blew past her, extinguishing her flashlight. Total darkness swallowed them. Amy screamed, and Ryan swore, fumbling for his own flashlight. The air turned dense, and a putrid smell wafted up from somewhere below deck, rotting seaweed mixed with the acrid scent of decay. The floor beneath them seemed to tremble, as though the ship itself were drawing breath. "Turn on the light, Ryan," Zara cried, clutching Amy's arm. "I'm trying." "It won't." Ryan's voice cut off. A deathly silence settled. Zara's chest tightened. "Ryan," she whispered. There was no answer. Amy's grip on Zara's hand tightened to the point of pain. "Where did he go?" Amy choked out. Her voice trembled, nearly breaking. "He was just here, Zara. What's happening?" "Ryan," Zara shouted, her voice echoing uselessly through the empty corridor. She fumbled with her flashlight, but it was dead, as if the batteries had been sucked dry in an instant. Panic clamped down on her chest, but before she could act, the giggle came again. This time, it sounded much, much closer. "Hide and seek," a childlike voice whispered, thin and raspy, coming from somewhere in the dark. "You hide, I seek." Zara's pulse hammered in her ears. She turned, yanking Amy along, and stumbled blindly through the hallway. Their footsteps echoed and mixed with the eerie creaks of the ship. The fog thickened, and the sense of something dreadful following them, something watching, grew heavier. They ran until they reached a stairwell leading down into the ship's bowels. Desperation and confusion warred in Zara's mind. Downstairs was the last place she wanted to go, but the hallway behind them felt choked with invisible eyes. Gripping Amy's hand, Zara pulled her friend down the stairs. They descended into the ship's guts, into the belly of rusted metal, cold and dripping with condensation. Each step echoed ominously, and Zara felt sure that whatever was chasing them could hear their every move. At the bottom, they emerged into a wide cargo hold. Crates were stacked haphazardly, and thick chains dangled from the ceiling like the tendrils of some monstrous creature. The air reeked of salt and decay. Amy sobbed, her voice barely a whisper. "What's happening to us? Where's Ryan?" "I don't know," Zara whispered, barely holding herself together. "But we have to hide. Maybe we can wait until someone finds us." They crept behind a stack of crates, pressing themselves into the shadows. Zara held her breath, straining to hear any sound over the thunder of her heart. Minutes dragged on in suffocating silence, and then she heard it. Wet, shuffling footsteps, dragging across the metal floor. The sound was slow and deliberate, growing louder as whatever it was neared their hiding place. Zara swallowed hard, her body frozen. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, a raspy voice whispered from the other side of the crates. "Found you." A cold hand shot between the crates, grabbing Zara's ankle. She screamed, kicking desperately, but the hand didn't feel human. It was slimy, boneless, like a tentacle that oozed cold sludge onto her skin. She pulled free, dragging Amy with her as they ran, their screams echoing through the cavernous hold. Zara glanced back, and in the gloom, she caught a glimpse of something slithering through the shadows. Pale, dead eyes, too many of them, stared out at her from a mass of waterlogged limbs. Seaweed and barnacles clung to its corpse-like body, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. They sprinted blindly, bursting into another hallway lined with storage rooms. But something was wrong. Water sloshed around their feet, rising steadily from below. The ship was flooding. The thought was both horrifying and surreal, as if they had somehow stepped into a nightmare they couldn't wake from. "Help!" Amy screamed, her voice cracking. "Somebody help us!" Their pleas echoed uselessly as the water continued to rise, soaking them to the waist. Zara stumbled, her legs going numb from the freezing brine. Something slithered past her underwater, brushing against her calf. She pulled Amy into a nearby storage room, slamming the door shut. Water surged under the door, but at least they were temporarily alone. Zara leaned against the wall, shivering uncontrollably. "This can't be happening," she whispered, clinging to hope that they could survive this. But when she turned to Amy, her friend's face had gone slack with terror. She was staring at something behind Zara. Slowly, Zara turned around. In the back of the storage room, submerged halfway in the rising water, a row of figures stood motionless. They wore sailors' uniforms, their bodies twisted and bloated with seawater, skin mottled and crawling with worms. Their eyes rolled toward her, dead yet somehow aware. One of the sailors opened his mouth, water and insects spilling from his bloated lips. "Join us," he gurgled, extending a rotting hand. The lights flickered wildly, and the room filled with a deafening roar of rushing water. Zara barely had time to scream before the icy ocean swallowed everything. The last thing she heard was the echo of that giggling child, delighting in their terror as the darkness closed in. Above, the mariner's bane drifted silently onward through the fog, taking its secrets and its victims back to the bottomless hungry sea. The luxury cruise ship Ocean's Embrace had always been known for its extravagant experiences, themed masquerade balls, five-star dining, and promises of paradisiacal adventures. Yet tonight, under a moon cloaked in storm clouds, the ship seemed nothing like the glossy dream advertised in brochures. It loomed on the endless black water, a ghostly palace adrift in a sea of shadows. Alex Turner, a seasoned traveler, had boarded the Ocean's Embrace with high hopes for a carefree vacation. But as he wandered the upper deck alone, the joviality of the past few days felt like a distant memory. The storm had forced most passengers inside, and a heavy, unnatural mist curled around the railings, shrouding everything in an eerie, spectral glow. A chill wind whispered across his skin, and the ship itself seemed to groan as it pitched gently with the waves. Alex gripped the metal railing and peered into the abyss. The sea was black, ink-thick, and restless. As he stood there, a strange sound emerged from the depths. A long, drawn-out wail, almost like a person crying out. The sound made Alex's skin crawl. "What the hell?" he muttered, straining to see through the mist. The wail cut off abruptly, leaving only the hollow slap of the waves against the hull. It had to be the wind, he told himself, or some echo of the storm brewing above. But then he saw it, a dark figure in the water. At first he thought it was debris, a piece of luggage or a torn piece of cloth, but as he squinted, the object seemed to rise, bobbing unnaturally on the surface. A pale face emerged, features twisted in agony. The figure reached out with skeletal, waterlogged hands, and Alex realized with horror that it was a woman. Her eyes were wide and blank, her mouth stretched in an eternal scream. Alex stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the wet deck. His heart raced, and he looked around wildly. "Help!" he called, his voice lost in the mist. "There's someone in the water." No one appeared to hear him. The party guests had retreated to the lower decks, and the only sounds were the whistling wind and the slap of water against metal. Alex turned back to the railing, but the ghostly woman had vanished, swallowed by the waves. "Jesus," he whispered, rubbing his eyes. Maybe it was a trick of the fog, an illusion conjured by his overactive imagination. But deep down, he knew that what he had seen was real. He hurried back toward the main deck, desperate to find someone, anyone, to talk to. As he moved, the ship seemed to twist around him. Hallways felt longer, darker, and a sense of vertigo made him feel as though the deck was tilting in directions it shouldn't. He pushed through a set of glass doors, stepping into the grand ballroom, which was deserted save for flickering candlelight that cast shadows across the mirrored walls. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing. The echoes whispered back to him, curling through the cavernous room. Alex's footsteps slowed as he noticed something odd. Faint, wet footprints appeared on the polished floor, trailing toward the center of the ballroom. He hesitated, the fine hair on his arms standing up. The footprints weren't his. A sudden crash made him jump. One of the massive crystal chandeliers above shuddered violently, and he could swear he saw movement reflected in the mirrors lining the walls. A figure, blurred and shadowy, slipped between the reflections, darting out of view whenever he turned to face it directly. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. He was met with silence, but the footprints continued to appear, one after another, as if someone invisible were approaching him. Each print glistened with seawater, and the air grew colder. Alex backed away, bumping into a table set with delicate wine glasses. One of the glasses tipped over, rolling toward the edge, but it never hit the floor. Instead, it floated, suspended midair. Alex watched in frozen terror as the glass shattered with an unseen force, fragments flying past his face. The ballroom lights surged and flickered, and a freezing wind swept through the room, carrying the smell of salt and decay. A shadow coalesced in the center of the dance floor, condensing into a figure draped in seaweed and tattered fabric. It was the same ghostly woman from the water, her hair dripping black brine, her eyes lifeless and full of rage. "You left us," she whispered, her voice bubbling like something drowning. "You all left us to the sea." Alex stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I don't understand," he stammered. "I wasn't here. I didn't do anything." The ghost's face twisted in fury. "You are all guilty," she hissed. "Guilty of forgetting." With that, the mirrors around the ballroom exploded, shards raining down like glittering knives. Alex threw his arms over his head, running blindly for the exit. As he fled into the hallway, he collided with a steward, a young woman with wide, panicked eyes. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her voice quivering. Alex grabbed her shoulders, desperate to explain. "There's something in there. A ghost, a woman from the sea. She's angry, and she's real." The steward's face paled, but she didn't look as surprised as he expected. "It's happening again," she whispered, almost to herself. "What's happening?" Alex demanded, his grip tightening. "Every time," she said, her voice hollow. "Every voyage, they come back. They were lost at sea when this ship first launched, and now they want us to join them. We've tried to escape, but the sea never forgets. Before Alex could respond, the ship shuddered violently. An ear-splitting groan echoed from deep within the hull, and a wave of freezing water surged up the hallway, sweeping them off their feet. The ocean roared as it crashed through the corridors, dragging passengers and crew alike into its cold, merciless embrace. Alex struggled, water filling his lungs as he was pulled into the depths of the ship. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was the ghostly woman, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth curled in a mournful smile. The ocean's embrace drifted on, a silent, haunted vessel carrying secrets of the past. The sea had claimed what it was owed, and the passengers, like so many before them, became just another chapter in the cursed ship's legend. Above deck, the fog thickened, and the storm clouds swallowed the moon, leaving only darkness to keep the memories. The cruise ship Starlight Sovereign cut through the sea like a jeweled dagger, its decks glittering with golden lights. But on this voyage, the only jewels glistening were beads of cold sweat, the kind that accompanied a sense of dread that no luxury could mask. Passengers and crew alike whispered rumors of the ship's dark secret, a legend about a ghostly woman who walked its decks when the sea was restless. Few believed it, and those who did dismissed it as a spooky yarn told to keep thrill-seekers entertained. Nathan Calloway, a newlywed on his honeymoon with his wife Jessica, had heard the tale and laughed it off as nonsense. But now, as he wandered the eerily quiet deck alone, he wasn't laughing. Jessica had gone to bed hours earlier, but Nathan found himself unable to sleep. The stillness of the ocean gnawed at him, and so he decided a late-night walk would settle his nerves. The wind was strangely still, the air humid and heavy, clinging to his skin like a wet shroud. The ship, usually full of life, felt hollow, its once festive atmosphere curdled into something oppressive and sinister. As he walked, he noticed something strange, a light flickering at the far end of the deck, near the ship's bow. Faulty bulb? Nathan muttered to himself, picking up his pace. But as he approached, he saw that the flickering light wasn't coming from a fixture. It was an old-fashioned lantern, swinging gently from a ghostly hand. The lantern's glow barely illuminated the figure holding it. A woman dressed in a soaking wet, tattered ball gown, her hair hanging in limp, sodden strands around her face. She looked like something dredged from the bottom of the ocean. Her head was bowed, her bare feet trailing pools of seawater. Nathan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct told him to back away slowly, but before he could move, the woman's head snapped up and he saw her face. Her eyes were wide, impossibly dark, and tears of salt water streamed down her pale, waterlogged cheeks. Her lips moved, forming silent words, but no sound came out. "Ma'am?" Nathan said shakily, his voice cracking. "Are you all right?" The woman tilted her head, her eyes glinting with something between grief and rage. She raised a hand, and a single, trembling finger pointed past Nathan, back the way he had come. Nathan's mouth went dry. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. The deck was empty, but something was wrong. The ship, which should have been gently rocking, was completely still, like it was anchored to the sea. The silence deepened, so thick it felt like it was pressing on his eardrums. And then he saw it. Shadows moving across the glass windows of the dining hall. Shapes that looked disturbingly human. The figures danced in pairs, drifting across the windows in a grotesque imitation of ballroom waltzes. Nathan's pulse quickened. He backed away from the ghostly woman and the shadows, nearly tripping over his own feet. He turned to run, but he didn't get far. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant noise that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean itself. Suddenly, the deck tilted violently, throwing Nathan off balance and sending him crashing into the railing. The sea below churned, dark and restless, and something pale broke the surface. Nathan's eyes widened in horror. Corpses, hundreds of them, floated just beneath the water's surface, their arms outstretched, mouths open in silent screams. The bodies seemed tethered to the ship, dragged along like broken marionettes. "Save us," a voice whispered, echoing in his ears. Nathan turned back to the ghostly woman. She had moved closer, her face inches from his. Her breath smelled of salt and decay, and her eyes were endless pools of sorrow. "What do you want?" Nathan choked out, his voice strangled with fear. "Justice," she whispered, her voice both ancient and full of pain. "They never let us leave." Before he could respond, something icy and unyielding closed around his ankles. He looked down, horror flooding his veins. A pair of ghostly hands had emerged from the deck itself, translucent and dripping with seawater. They pulled at him, dragging him down, and he screamed. Nathan clawed at the railing, his hands slipping on the wet metal as he fought the impossible grip. The ship groaned again, the sound splitting the air like thunder, and more hands appeared, grasping at his legs, his waist, pulling him deeper. The ghostly woman watched with empty, tear-streaked eyes. Nathan's screams went unanswered, swallowed by the sound of the sea as he was pulled down into darkness. The last thing he saw was the woman's face, her mouth finally opening wide in a soundless wail, as if mourning him and every soul before him that the ship had claimed. The Starlight Sovereign settled back into its gentle, deceptive lull, drifting quietly under a sky that had never known peace. The next morning, the crew would search for Nathan, assuming he had fallen overboard in the night, but they would never find his body. The sea kept its secrets, and so did the cursed ship, hungry and waiting for the next soul to claim. The luxury cruise liner, the Elysian Star, promised its guests a voyage through paradise, blue skies, calm seas, and endless entertainment. But no one expected the darkness that lay deep beneath those sparkling waters, nor the horror that would surface to greet them. Eli Hayes was among the guests, enjoying a drink on the lower deck while the sun dipped below the horizon, setting the sky ablaze with hues of orange and purple. The ship's evening festivities were already in full swing, with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses drifting through the warm air. Eli, a skeptic by nature, had brushed off the rumors that spread earlier in the cruise about the Elysian Star's past. The ship had been built over the wreck of an old freighter that had vanished mysteriously decades ago, and the waters they now traveled were supposedly haunted. To Eli, it was just a story, a spooky tale for gullible tourists. But tonight, as the last slivers of sunlight vanished and the sea turned to ink, something shifted. The laughter seemed to fade unnaturally fast, and the ship's luxurious charm began to feel more like a veneer hiding something ugly. A chill crept through the air, and Eli noticed that the guests around him were growing uneasy, whispering and glancing over their shoulders. He dismissed it until he felt it too, a presence, heavy and cold, pressing down on him. "Must be the night air," he muttered, rubbing the goosebumps on his arms. He stood up and wandered away from the crowd, heading toward the starboard side to clear his head. As he reached the railing, he looked out over the dark, restless waves. The sea was unnervingly still, almost as if holding its breath. Then he heard it, a faint, mournful whisper. Eli froze, his hand tightening around the metal railing. The whisper was low and rasping, carrying over the water like a sad song. It was followed by another sound, a soft, wet slap, like something climbing up the side of the ship. His heart began to pound as he strained to see through the darkness. "Hello?" he called out, more to reassure himself than anything else. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and shadows began to pool along the water's edge. Eli's breath caught in his throat as he saw pale, ghostly hands emerging from the sea. They gripped the side of the ship, long fingers dripping salt water, and pulled up bodies that looked as if they had drowned ages ago. Their faces were bloated, their eyes empty, and their mouths gaped open, leaking brine and seaweed. Eli stumbled backward, his legs like jelly. More of the drowned figures clambered over the railing, their movements jerky and unnatural, leaving trails of water behind them. One of them, a woman in a rotting evening gown, fixed him with hollow eyes. She raised a hand, pointing directly at him. "Help us," she croaked, her voice bubbling as though she still had water in her lungs. Eli's rational mind shattered. He turned and bolted, running across the deck as the drowned souls advanced. Their whispers turned into a collective wail, echoing through the corridors of the ship, reaching every guest. Screams erupted as the passengers saw the impossible, wet, decayed figures dragging themselves out of the sea, clambering onto the deck, their fingers reaching for the living. Eli's feet pounded on the floor as he raced inside, his heart feeling like it would burst. He found himself in the grand dining hall, where chaos had erupted. Tables were overturned, crystal glasses shattered, and people pushed and screamed, desperate to escape. But the ship's doors slammed shut on their own, trapping everyone inside. The drowned souls began to seep through the walls, their spectral forms bleeding water onto the opulent carpet. "What do you want?" Eli yelled, backing into a corner as one of the ghosts, a man in a captain's uniform, approached him. The captain's face was sunken, with barnacles clinging to his hollow cheeks. "You sail over our graves," the ghostly captain intoned, his voice a rumbling echo. "You disturbed our rest." Eli shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "We didn't know. It's just a cruise." The captain's eyes, dead and glassy, showed no mercy. "The sea never forgets," he said. "You took this voyage of your own will. Now you belong to us." The lights in the dining hall flickered, and water began to gush from the ceiling, flooding the room with impossible speed. Eli was swept off his feet, the freezing water swallowing him. He fought to keep his head above the rising tide, but ghostly hands grabbed at him from below, dragging him under. His screams were muffled as water filled his mouth, and the last thing he saw before darkness closed in was the captain's cold, relentless eyes. Above deck, the storm that had been brewing in the distance finally broke, waves crashing against the Elysian star. But when the sun rose the next morning, the ocean was calm once more. The ship drifted, silent and empty, as if no one had ever been aboard. The star would be found days later, abandoned and pristine, with no trace of its passengers or crew. Authorities would dismiss it as a maritime mystery, but those who heard the whispers knew the truth. The sea had claimed them, just as it had claimed others before, and somewhere deep below, in the endless, unforgiving darkness, the souls of the lost drifted on, forever trapped between the living and the dead. The luxury cruise liner, the Neptune's Requiem, was known for its opulent suites, lavish meals, and nightly entertainment that drew guests from all over the world. But on the fifth night of its voyage across the Atlantic, a thick, unnatural fog descended, shrouding the ship in a gray veil, so dense that even the powerful spotlights on deck couldn't cut through it. The sea was so eerily calm that the passengers could hear the foghorns echoing back to them from some distant, invisible void. Maya Wilson stood on the upper promenade, gripping the railing and squinting into the haze. She had come on the cruise to forget, and escape from a bitter breakup that had left her feeling untethered. Yet, here in the fog, the oppressive silence only reminded her of how alone she truly was. Only the occasional sound of laughter or footsteps from fellow passengers drifted through the mist, but even those echoes seemed hollow. "Creepy, isn't it?" A man's voice interrupted her thoughts. Maya turned to see a fellow passenger, a man in his mid-30s with kind eyes and a camera hanging around his neck. "Yeah," Maya replied, managing a small smile. "Feels like the ship's floating through a ghost story." The man chuckled. "I'm Brian," he said, offering a handshake. "Amateur photographer. Thought the fog would make for some moody shots, but it's too thick for even my best lens." Maya was about to respond when a cold breeze swept through, and with it came a sound, faint melodic singing echoing from somewhere deep in the mist. It was ethereal, almost hypnotic, and sent a shiver down Maya's spine. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Brian frowned, adjusting his camera strap. "Yeah, sounds like singing," Maya finished. The melody grew clearer, as more beautiful, and yet impossibly mournful. It sounded like a choir of voices blending together in perfect harmony, and she found herself leaning forward, straining to hear. Brian did the same, his eyes unfocused, drawn into the haunting music. Then, suddenly, a scream pierced the fog, cutting through the air like a knife. It came from somewhere below deck, and the spell of the music shattered. Maya and Brian jolted, looking at each other with wide, alarmed eyes. "What was that?" Maya said, her voice tight. "Stay here," Brian said, but Maya grabbed his arm. "No way. If something's happening, we should stick together." The two hurried toward the staircase that led down to the main deck, where a small crowd had gathered, their faces pale and frightened. A crew member, his uniform soaked with sweat, was trying to calm a woman who was hysterically sobbing. "She was there," the woman screamed, pointing out into the fog. "She was calling to me. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes." Maya and Brian pushed through the crowd, trying to get a glimpse of what was happening. "What's going on?" Brian asked another guest, an older man who clutched a rosary. "Some lady says she saw something out there," the man whispered, crossing himself. "A ghost, maybe." The crew member tried to reassure everyone. "Please, return to your cabins. There's nothing to worry about. We're handling it." But before he could finish, the singing returned, louder this time. It surrounded the ship, reverberating through the metal hull, and Maya felt the sound vibrating in her bones. It was so heartbreakingly beautiful that she almost cried. Guests around her began to sway, as if entranced, their eyes glazing over. Then, one by one, passengers began stepping toward the railing, drawn to the siren call. Maya grabbed Brian's arm again. "We have to get away from here," she said, fear turning her voice to a whisper. Brian was staring into the fog, his pupils dilated. "It's so beautiful," he murmured, taking a step forward. "Brian!" Maya shook him, panic surging. "Snap out of it!" He blinked, shaking his head as if waking from a dream. What happened?" But the others weren't so lucky. One woman climbed the railing and threw herself over the edge without a sound, disappearing into the misty sea. Others followed, each one stepping calmly into the water, as though they were joining the voices in the deep. "No!" Maya screamed, but it was too late. The fog seemed to close in tighter, swallowing the desperate cries of those who tried to pull their loved ones back. Suddenly, the singing stopped, and an eerie silence descended. The passengers who hadn't jumped snapped out of their trances, looking around in confusion and horror at the empty spaces where friends and family members had once stood. Maya's hands shook as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. "What the hell is going on?" Brian whispered. Before anyone could answer, the fog began to thin, revealing figures standing on the deck. Maya's heart nearly stopped. These figures were dressed in tattered, sea-soaked clothes from eras long past, sailors and passengers from ships that had been lost to the ocean over the centuries. Their eyes were wide and unseeing, mouths twisted into sad, eerie smiles. One of the ghostly women stepped forward, her translucent gown dripping water. She looked directly at Maya, her expression full of sorrow. "You sail on borrowed time," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 drowned souls. "The sea always remembers its debts." The fog thickened again, and in an instant the ghostly figures vanished, leaving only the survivors and their terror. The ship's emergency sirens wailed, but no one could comprehend what had just happened. Maya and Brian clung to each other, their breath ragged, as they realized the nightmare wasn't over. The Neptune's Requiem had awakened something ancient, something that had waited patiently beneath the waves. And it would not rest until every soul on board had paid the price. The Obsidian Voyager was a cruise ship famed for its exclusive route through the Arctic Circle, treating its elite passengers to the ethereal beauty of the Northern Lights. But there was a darkness to this part of the world, an isolation that felt older than time. And on the fourth night of the voyage, it came creeping. Adeline Harper had booked the cruise to chase wonder and adventure. She bundled herself in a heavy coat, stepping out onto the observation deck just before midnight, hoping to catch a glimpse of the aurora borealis. The air was freezing, biting into her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on the sky, waiting for the magical display to begin. As she waited, a soft, eerie whisper threaded through the wind. Adeline frowned, turning her head. The deck was almost deserted, save for a few other passengers scattered around, bundled in thick coats and scarves. She could have sworn the whisper had spoken her name. "Must be the wind," she murmured, rubbing her gloved hands together for warmth. But the whisper came again, clearer now. It sounded like a woman's voice, ghostly and desperate. "Adeline." Her heart skipped a beat. How could someone know her name? Adeline looked around, her breath puffing out in small clouds of mist. The other passengers seemed oblivious, staring out at the endless expanse of ice and sea. She gripped the railing, trying to shake off the chill that was seeping into her bones. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the deck, draped in an old-fashioned tattered gown that fluttered in the frigid wind. Her hair was wild and tangled, her skin pale as moonlight. But what unsettled Adeline most were the woman's eyes, wide, hollow, and leaking frozen tears that glittered like shards of glass. Adeline's legs turned to lead. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The ghostly woman raised a hand, beckoning her with stiff, brittle fingers. "Adeline," she whispered again, her voice cracking like ice. No, this isn't real," Adeline stammered, backing away. But as she stepped back, the ship gave a sudden, violent lurch. Adeline stumbled, gripping the railing to keep from falling. Around her, other passengers screamed as the ship trembled, the deck shifting and groaning as if something massive was moving beneath it. The ocean was no longer calm. Huge chunks of ice began to drift toward the ship, surrounding it in a crushing embrace. Adeline struggled to her feet, panic flaring. The ghostly woman was gone, but her presence lingered, pressing heavily on the night. "What's happening?" Adeline yelled to a nearby crew member who was frantically speaking into a walkie-talkie. But he offered no comfort. his face white with fear. Before anyone could make sense of the chaos, the whispering grew louder, multiplied. It came from the water, from the ice, from the very air around them. Adeline clapped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to muffle the haunting chorus of voices. The ice closed in tighter, and Adeline could see shapes moving beneath the surface. Human figures trapped in the ice, their faces twisted in silent screams. They were dressed in old-fashioned winter gear, their bodies forever preserved in icy tombs. The sight of them stole the breath from her lungs. The deck erupted in more screams as the ice split open, and ghostly figures began to climb onto the ship. They moved stiffly, their limbs creaking like old wood, eyes dead and glistening with frozen sorrow. Some were sailors, others passengers from an era long past, and all of them wore expressions of unimaginable grief. Adeline tried to run, but one of the ghosts reached her first, grabbing her wrist with a hand colder than death itself. She was pulled around to face a man whose eyes were white with frost, his lips blue and cracked. He leaned in close, and when he spoke, his voice was the brittle snap of shattering ice. "Lost. We are lost," he groaned. "Take our place. Free us." Adeline's knees buckled, and she sank to the freezing deck, her pulse pounding in her ears. Around her, the other passengers were being surrounded, trapped by the phantoms that emerged from the ice. Their cold fingers reached for the living, desperate to exchange their eternal prison for the warmth of life. "No, please," Adeline begged, tears freezing on her cheeks. She tried to wrench free, but the grip on her wrist only tightened. The ghost's face twisted with grief. "You sail where we sank," he said. "We were promised paradise, but we found only the grave. The sea remembers, and it has chosen you." Adeline's vision blurred as more ghostly hands grabbed her, pulling her closer to the ship's edge. The icy wind howled, and the aurora borealis finally appeared above, casting a beautiful but haunting glow over the nightmare unfolding on the deck. The lights twisted and danced, but instead of wonder, they only brought dread. With a final desperate scream, Adeline was dragged over the side of the ship into the frigid embrace of the Arctic Sea. The last thing she felt was the crushing, merciless cold. When dawn broke, the obsidian Voyager drifted silently, surrounded by shattered ice. The fog had lifted, revealing a serene, white landscape. There were no signs of the terror from the night before, no clues as to what had happened to the passengers who had disappeared. But deep below, in the icy depths, new souls had joined the frozen ranks, their whispers forever trapped beneath the waves. The sea had claimed its debt, and the obsidian Voyager sailed on, waiting for its next unsuspecting victims. The Eternal Dusk was a smaller, luxurious cruise ship that promised its passengers an intimate, unforgettable experience as they sailed through the Baltic Sea. The ship was opulent yet cozy, catering to travelers who preferred an escape from the usual crowds. It was said that the sea here held centuries of stories, some full of beauty, others full of pain. On the 6th night of the voyage, a storm gathered. It arrived with little warning, painting the sky a dark, menacing gray. Lightning slashed the heavens, illuminating the rolling waves that battered the hull. But that wasn't the strangest thing. As the storm intensified, the ship's clock stopped, freezing at exactly midnight. The hands refused to budge, and a heavy silence settled over the passengers. Nina, a solo traveler who had come on the cruise to find peace and maybe a bit of adventure, was in the ship's lavish library when she noticed it. The grandfather clock that stood in the corner had stopped, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. She frowned, feeling an odd sense of dread as thunder rumbled outside. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a chill ran through the room. The cozy warmth of the library evaporated, replaced by an unnatural cold. Nina's breath came out in misty puffs, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Just as she was about to leave, the door slammed shut on its own, and the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely audible beneath the wind and thunder. But soon the whispers became clear, wrapping around her like invisible hands. "They're still here," they said, voices blending and overlapping. "They're still waiting." Nina's heart raced, and she backed away, her eyes darting around the library. The shadows seemed to stretch and move, taking on forms that shouldn't exist. A book fell from one of the shelves, landing open on the floor. Nina couldn't help but look, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The page was blank, save for a single sentence that had appeared as if written in a hurry. "We are the lost." The door to the library creaked open, and Nina spun around. She saw a man standing there, his face partially obscured by shadow. He wore an old naval uniform soaked through with seawater, his boots leaving wet footprints on the carpet. His eyes were dark, empty voids, and his expression was a mixture of sorrow and longing. Nina stumbled back, but the man didn't move. Instead, he lifted one hand and pointed past her, toward the windows. She hesitated, then slowly turned her head. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see the sea boiling and frothing with the storm's fury. But in between the waves, she saw something else. The wreckage of a ship. It was ancient, splintered and decaying, but it was there, just beneath the surface, illuminated by flashes of lightning. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "They're still here," it repeated. "You sail their waters." Nina ran from the library, her pulse pounding in her ears. She needed to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But as she stumbled down the corridors, she noticed that the entire ship felt off. Shadows danced and stretched unnaturally. Doors opened and closed with ghostly precision. Passengers wandered aimlessly, their faces blank, as if in a trance. She finally burst onto the main deck, rain soaking her to the bone. Crew members were desperately trying to keep control of the vessel, shouting orders that were lost in the storm. But what caught Nina's attention was the water. The waves were churning violently, but they seemed to be full of faces, distorted, ghostly faces, pressing up against the surface of the sea, mouths open in silent screams. "Nina," a voice whispered behind her. She spun around to see a woman standing there, dressed in a beautiful but waterlogged gown, her hair clinging to her face. The woman's eyes were filled with tears that shimmered like seawater. "You have to help us," she begged, her voice breaking. "We're trapped." Who are you?" Nina asked, her voice trembling. The ghostly woman reached out, her hand passing through Nina's arm like a cold breeze. "We were passengers, just like you. We were on the Midnight Siren, a ship lost to these waters a century ago. We were promised a paradise, a journey full of joy, but the sea took us, and it won't let us go." Nina backed away, her mind racing. The storm seemed to grow angrier, as if it resented the woman for speaking the truth. "How can I help you?" Nina shouted, trying to be heard over the wind. The woman's sorrowful gaze held Nina's. "Find our names. Honor our memory. Only then will we be free." Before Nina could ask more, a tremendous wave crashed over the side of the ship, sending her sprawling. She scrambled back, gasping for air, as the ghostly woman vanished into the mist. The faces in the sea began to pull back, sinking once more into the depths, but their sorrowful cries echoed long after they disappeared. When morning came, the storm had dissipated, and the sea was calm once more. The eternal dusk drifted through the water, its passengers shaken but alive. But Nina knew the truth. The sea held secrets, and it would never fully release the souls it had claimed. As the ship continued its journey, she vowed to honor the lost travelers of the Midnight Siren, knowing that only then might the restless spirits find peace. Yet, in the quiet moments when the sea was still and the sky clear, she could still hear their whispers, reminding her that some debts to the sea were never truly paid.